let's kick things off with Game 1 from the 2021 World Championship between the boss, Magnus Carlsen, and the #1 Russian player and challenger, Nepo. So, what normally happens in the first few games of a World Championship match? Typically, one or both players will play an opening that is not their first choice. Say, for instance, in the 2016 World Championship match, I was present for Game 1, and Carlsen played the Trompowsky. Well, why would you, in a World Championship match, especially in the first few games, play something that you didn't intend to play, the main stuff that you have prepared? Well, we want to waste time of our opponent, because what Magnus did in this game, I want to really highlight the move Knight A5 when we get to it. It's a rare move, and that's going to make the seconds go crazy scrambling to try to analyze this type of move in case it occurs again in, say, Game 3. So let's get to it and see what I'm talking about here. So Nepo is white in this game, and he started off with E4, and Carlsen gets to a mainstay of his repertoire with the Spanish. And we're going to move right along until we get to the first interesting moment, which is right here. And typical theory will be with C3, that's the most common move. And judging by how Magnus played the game, I feel like if C3 was played, he would be going for a Marshall type system. And though black gives up a pawn, he gets tremendous play and definitely has initiative for that pawn, a theme we're going to see in the main game itself. And players are quite comfortable. I remember analyzing the Marshall pretty heavily back in the early 2000s in the games of Michael Adams. Very interesting stuff. So Nepo goes with H3, and I don't know if you can classify that one as one of the anti-Marshalls, but it's a move that's been played quite a lot in theory. A4 is another one, and that's reminiscent of the short, or I should say Kasparov short match of 92, where I believe it was in Game 1, A4 was played. But that was one of those matches that it was a bloodbath for Nigel, as I believe he only won one game in that entire match. Kasparov had a note about the match predicting during the candidates who he would face. And he said, it's going to be short, and it's going to be short. And I always thought that was a vicious critique, but the man was not wrong. So after H3, far more common moves here are Bishop B7 and D6. That's been played thousands and thousands of times in the database. But right here, this is that I'm not playing my main stuff in one of the first games. I'm not showing my cards. I think Nepo may have had some of that with H3, not quite sure. But Knight A5 has been played roughly 35 times in practice, and white scores nearly 80%. Typically a second, and even myself as an openings author, I'm typically not going to really investigate something that looks like it just wins for the other side statistically. So checking it with the engine, it's a reasonable move, and it gets a game, which is the main thing Magnus is known for with his preparation. A lot of people put a huge emphasis on Magnus' in-game skill, but honestly, his opening preparation is top-notch. He's worked with many of the best players in the world as seconds, and the man's got ideas, needless to say. And what we get, knight takes E5, the bishop pair for a pawn, good development, and a position much like the aforementioned Marshall Gambit in flavor. Great development. And for the price of a pawn, how much are you willing to pay? Because in this position, black's connected his rooks, developed his pieces, has castled, and white still has all these pieces on their starting squares. A lot of people will say a pawn is a pawn, but my preference is for the extra time and pieces here. So let's keep going and see how white's playing this. Queen f3, and excellent move, trying to take the fire out of the position and preventing checkmate, of course. Bishop d6, king f1. And this was another quick first choice move by Magnus, which tells me that he was still in preparation or he's just really good at chess. So that's it's probably the second one. Queen takes, and more flexible as knight takes, eyeing that juicy b4 square for the knight. So bishop d2, understandable, trying to get more control over b4, which is the key square we're fighting over. And right here is where I felt the real game actually begins. And I think Nepo took a 15 to 20 minute think here, and in turn Carlsen did the exact same thing. So knight f3 was eventually played, and this is hunker down mode. And there are some interesting defensive ideas here and offensive ideas here for both sides that I wanted to highlight. So if you're a pause your video type of person, this is where I not only want you to come up with a move slash a plan, a series of moves, or an idea that is really forming your plan, and tell me what the goals are of both sides. All right, hopefully you paused your video and tried to do that. Now, black is a pawn down. That is the first thing to register, and for that pawn we have the bishop pair. Now, we have these statements in chess like when up material, trade down. If you just make equal trades here, you can very well end up in a struggling endgame to draw with black. So when you're down material, the goal is to keep the tension. And this is an excellent example game for how to keep the tension and keep pressure on your opponent. Keep in mind the time controls in World Championship is 2 hours per player starting off. I know they get 30 seconds per move, which is typical in FIDE. And I believe at move 40, they get another hour to think. So time is not a factor in these games. So you have to play the most that you can. But, I mean, even with any time control, you can put pressure on your opponent in the long term. So here, it's critical to understand that we need to keep tension. And I found this position interesting because I was only looking at 2 candidate moves, and it's a typical process going back to, say, Kotov's Think Like a Grandmaster, where he was all about candidate moves. Because if you just start calculating, you pick one move and start calculating, calculation without a plan or narrowing things down is typically going to be wasted effort. And especially in fast time control games like we normally play in tournaments, it's going to cost you. So here, 2 of my candidate moves were f6 and knight b4. And f6 is more than likely what I would play if I had this position, because we have a steady plan here. 1, I'm limiting the squares, the forward squares of the f3 knight. 2, I can go king f7, I can follow up with g5, potentially h5, and everyone in the position is working, and I've got slow improvement. Now, the engine definitely told me that there is excellent play here for white. White's struggling with development. If knight c3 happens, we have knight b4, much like what happens in the main game where the c2 pawn can become a liability. Well, another pause your video. What is the best defensive idea against this knight b4 plan, which did not happen in the game? All right, hopefully you paused and tried to figure it out. Rook e2, followed by knight e1. The rook still needed to have some control over the e-file, and this gives the flexibility to complete development with that knight that wasn't working in the game. And now we're going to be looking at slowly uncoiling. So I feel like white is on the better part of equality here if f6 was played. Now, the other move, the more direct move, knight b4, you go, well, why can't he take? And this becomes a very, very interesting position where black carries some edge, as the c-pawn is backwards, and we can very easily pile up on it and win it in many variations. We also have the option at many junctures in order to ruin the pawn structure, and that could very well get us compensation for the pawn that white has. So c4 makes a lot of sense from a defensive standpoint. I don't want to have to try to nurse that pawn, and I need to get developed. And after takes, bishop f4, limiting all of the squares of the b1 knight. Black has more than enough for his pawn, and I think he'll have no trouble making a draw here. And if white messes around too much, it could be even worse. Now, of course, the world champion is the world champion for a reason. He understands chess at an extremely high level, and he decided to go with none of the above. And he went with rook d8. And rook d8 makes a lot of sense when you see the move, because you go, okay, one, the rook on b8 served its purpose earlier by simply defending the b7 bishop. We are lining up the rook with d2. Potentially c4 could come at the right moment. This rook very well needs to go to c8. Knight b4 ideas are still looming in order to hit that weakness on c2. And it gives white opportunity to go wrong. Whereas knight b4, it's forcing, but rook d8 is more in the spirit of the position, in my opinion, because tension. Tension is the name of the game when you're down in material. Knight c3, now tension. Do I want to trade? No, I do not. Knight b4, put pressure on c2. And I felt this move was a bit awkward, but you need to figure out a way to defend the pawn. And I think in the main game, it's like, most of what we can get is kind of counterplay with capturing there. So I'm still looking at that rook e2, knight e1 key defensive idea to try to hold everything together. So knight c3, knight b4, rook a c8, and black is definitely doing quite well here. Knight e2, and here one of the few improvements on Carlsen's play in the game. We could go bishop e7, followed by rook d7 and g6, and we are just improving without any risk here. And it seems like white's knights are in a bit of a ball trying to still uncoil. Knight c6 was played, and knight e7, jockeying around. And bishop f4 is the moment now where we cannot avoid trading off our wonderful bishop pair. So we need to get something in turn in the position, and Carlsen sees the opportunity to bail out into this pawn down ending where the doubled f-pawns are going to be a liability. We first need to worry about our weak a pawn here, so rook c6, knight f5. The knight is very strong as it has the idea to come to d4, hitting both c2 and f3, so c3 stopping that. Knight h4, going after the weakness anyway. And here, I preferred, instead of king f8, which is a very understandable move, as you're simply controlling the e7 and e8 square. I like g6 a bit better. And after rook d1, rook f6, and white's going to have a lot of problems holding on to that pawn. But to each his own, world champion anyway. King f8. Bless you. Excuse me. Happens every now and then when I'm doing these types of videos. I just get a bit too excited. What can you do? Knight g2, knight f5, putting the question to the rook on e3. Now, g6, we get the same kind of structure in the game. Knight e1, holding on to the weaknesses. But even though black has been a pawn down this entire game, you can kind of feel that black was the one pressuring. And I'm a big fan of studying these types of games because if Nepo tried to push too hard here, I think game one could have ended in disaster. And you have to remember, even though they're the top players in the world, Carlsen has been here before, now numerous times, with Anad, Karyakin, and Caruana. This is Nepo's first game in a World Championship match, and I think we can all remember our first game in tournament play, and you play uncharacteristically, nervously, unless you're just a legend. But I can say that my first tournament game, I was very nervous. And I imagine the first game of a World Championship with all eyes on you is quite daunting. As we're going to finish this up, as Black has no issues. And I love this move, b4, securing the structure, and only Black has the potential to change the structure in a positive way at this point. Rook b8 with the idea of captures and taking on b3. And you don't want to give the d4 square by taking with the b pawn. So now, with a pawn in hand, Magnus starts to improve the position, and we end up with a draw by repetition, which is a very reasonable result for this game. And overall, I was very pleased with the quality of this game and the ideas shown as one of the, I don't even consider the first few games of the World Championship like the real deal. We'll start getting to the actual preparation that these guys have hidden by about game 4, which is typical. And with a 14-game match, we're definitely going to see some entertainment, as opposed to, say, Karyakin and Caruana, who both played very, very solid in the matches. One of the big negative critiques was, well, all the games were drawn. Okay, well, when Carlsen is not taking any risk and goes, I can beat the guy in the tie breaks without any difficulty, I can understand his point, not taking any unnecessary risk. But keep in mind, if you get up 1 point, the other guy is going to have to take risks. And that's when the fun stuff happens. So I'm hoping that we get something interesting. But one of the things that could make the World Championship match far, far more interesting, in my opinion, is to have the tie breaks first. If you have the tie breaks first, that's going to force the guy who lost the tie breaks to press harder during the match, creating more interesting games. So tell FIDE, yell at him about it. All right, join us as I will be doing all the games in this format on the Palm Beach Chess YouTube. So hopefully you enjoyed this quick little analysis of Game 1 from the 2021 World Chess Championship.